Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It is January 3, 2021, and today we are talking with Dr. Penny Edwards, Associate Professor in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Hello, Penny.
Hi, Luke. Good afternoon. And it's actually January the 2, 2021 here.
So it is. It is a real pleasure to have you on the show as someone who has published on Myanmar and many other Southeast Asian countries, notably Cambodia, in the fields of colonial history, gender, fashion and clothing, and heaps more. You've been working on an exciting book project about Myingun Mintha, an exiled prince during the Konbaung period or the Alongbiad dynasty. This exiled prince, he enters the history books as a failed rebel who undergoes what you call a multiple displacement. So who was this man? Who was Prince Myingun, and how did he come to leave his royal family and his home?
Thank you, Luke, for those questions and indeed for having me on the Myanmar Musings. So if we're speaking fact and figures and sort of biometrics, the Myingun Mintha was born in 1844. That's 1206 of the Buddhist era in Amarapura. His father was King Mindon, and that was a paternity that Myingun shared with 53 brothers and half-brothers. One of those brothers, Myingun Daing, his younger brother, accompanied him on his journey. He does power into history books in 1866 when he launched a coup in the palace, and his uncle, the Ganaung Prince, was the target of the coup. The coup was successful in that the Ganaung Prince was assassinated alongside several other princes and ministers. This all happened when his father, the king, Mindon, was not on scene. This event was what launched Myingun on his journey, but most mentions of Myingun sort of begin and end with the coup. You've asked, how did he come to leave his royal family and his home? Well, Myingun never left his royal family. Myingun actively cultivated that role and that lineage from exile. But he was banished from Burma by his father, King Mindon, after the assassination. And Myingun and a band of some 200 to 300 followers, together with his brother, Myingun Daing, and an uncle, succeeded in leaving Mandalay, commandeering a steamer, and making their way through several months of protracted resistance down to Thayet Myo, and eventually they ended up taking refuge in British Burma. And this all happened in 1866. So that's 20 years before Britain annexed Upper Burma.
And then he ended up in a kind of loose house arrest situation in what was then Rangoon, now Yangon.
Yeah.
How did that occur and what happened next?
So the British offered Myingun and Myingun Daing and Myingun's uncle, not the Ganaung Prince who he had assassinated, but another close figure and supporter of his movement, offered him status as sort of political refugees, if you like, in Rangoon, then of course under British control. And the brothers were moved between two houses, one of which was the house in which the British housed the last Mughal, who William Dalrymple writes about in his book, who also lived in exile and died in exile in Rangoon. So this was in around November, December of 1866. And a few months thereafter, Prince Myingun escaped. The terms of the house arrest were not that they could not leave the house. And in fact, Myingun used to ride around Rangoon in a horse and gharry, which were curtained. And he, in his own memoirs, as dictated to his secretary in the late 1910s in Saigon, he talks about having made numerous such trips and outings around Rangoon, and in fact connecting with Burmese monks and others in sort of clandestine meetings. But his biggest escapade was to cross over into Siam, into Karen lands, and it didn't take the British too long to figure out he'd gone missing. And this was of consternation not only to the British, but also to King Myingun, because at this time, Myingun was still heading up a resistance movement. And there's been a lot of speculation about who put Myingun up to the assassination. And some people have pointed the fingers at the British, particularly Captain Sladen, a big puzzle and a mystery, which I'm shedding some light on in my book through research I've done in various archives. A big question is, how come Prince Myingun, after this sudden rush on the palace and the assassination of the Crown Prince, how come he was able to commandeer a steamer that was under steam? It's not like a motorboat, right, that you can suddenly, turn on the engine and off you go. A steamer has to lay in steam for quite some hours. And so clearly there had been some pre-planning. But the constellation of interest behind Myingun's coup included not only courtiers and factions in the palace, as well as celebrities of the day, literary and astrologer celebrities like Upanya, who was believed to have tipped off Myingun with an auspicious date to launch his coup, but also various merchants, brokers. I mean, Mandalay was a very cosmopolitan place. One of the people with whom Myingun was in conversation at different points on his journey were the British. The British offered him refuge in Rangoon, and a condition of this refuge was that he was not to leave British territory. And this he did by crossing over into Siam and into Karen country. And he did that to seek support for his movement and his cause among the Karen. At this time, his brother stayed in Rangoon. The British sort of, ramped up surveillance on their lodgings. And what the British then did was to use his brother as a hostage or a pawn, if you like, and to send his brother, Prince Myingun dying, the younger brother, who claimed no knowledge of what Myingun was up to arrest him and send him off to the penal colony of the Andaman Islands, then also called Port Blair. And they did this hoping it would flush Myingun out of hiding. So Myingun did eventually come back into the vicinity of Rangoon, and he was caught and arrested. And he was, after no trial, he was sent also to the Andaman Islands. And both Myingun Daing and Myingun were detained as political prisoners under Regulation 3 of 1818. Myingun Daing was not actually kept in the Andaman Islands for too long. There was concern that this was no way to treat a prince. And he was moved to Benares. Myingun was shipped off straight away to the Andaman Islands. Then he was moved to Fortuna, by which time Myingun Daing was living in a small town called Bugulpur. And he had been sent there because the British, they rationalized that there was a college there and he would get good education. And Myingun Prince petitioned to and lobbied for his brother Myingun Daing to come and stay with him in the Andaman Islands and in Fortuna. So from this we know that there was a sort of a strong codependent relationship between the brothers. Myingun was showing signs of real sort of sadness apart from his brother, and his younger brother volunteered to be basically put into confinement so he could be close to Myingun. And eventually, after about a year, they were then both moved to Benares. So between 1866, 2nd of August, the coup, to December 1866, their move to Rangoon, to 1867, in February, Myingun fled into or moved off into Siam and Karen territories. And the imprisonment and transportation of both of the brothers to the Andaman Islands and to Fort Chunar. This all happened actually in just about 2 years, but from the point at which they both moved to Benares, which was by 1870, from that point until the early 1880s, so for a good 12 years, they really pretty much stayed put in Benares. And again, under a very loose house arrest, if you like. I mean, the house was watched, it was placed under surveillance, but there was back and forth with their servants coming in and out of the house. They had visitors coming in and out of the house. It was partly as a result of this traffic and visits, many visits also from their followers, and that's a big focus of my book, who was following Myingun. And I don't mean in the contemporary sense of Instagram followers and sort of magical instant followings, but protracted pledges of allegiance, the sending of gifts and support in an era when it would take weeks or months for a letter or goods or offerings to travel and for news to pass. So in Benares, and before that in Rangoon, people were sending gifts and messages of support to Myingun. In the early 1880s, Myingun began to get restless. He saw opportunity, and others in the palace with whom he was still in touch saw opportunity for him after the death of his father, King Myingun, and especially in the lead up to the deposition of King Tibor by the British in 1885. There's a whole period there where there are many different princely contenders to the throne, and much of the focus of the history of the royal family in Burma after the British annexation of Mandalay and the deportation, transportation, eviction of King Tibor and Queen Tupayalat to Ratnagiri. Much of the focus has been on King Tibor as the last royal, the last king. And this has been presented, and of course was a pivotal event and a massive rupture. But history on the ground was continuing, and there were many, many different contenders for the throne and for the allegiance of court factions, of monastic constituencies, and of lay people, as well as mercantile and commercial communities. And Prince Myingun remained one of the contenders for a possible return to the Burmese throne. And of all the movements and all the contenders and all the princely pretenders, not one of these movements was calling for the return of King Tibor. King Tibor also did really very little, if anything, to mobilize for any aspiration or possibility of return. And of course, given that he was very much under house arrest, I mean, that possibility was slim. But what I'm trying to say here is that Myingun, others such as the Naongyam Prince, the Nyaungyo Prince, other factions and princely contenders were really in the running for the possibility of the return to the throne. And there was a period when the British were considering putting another prince on the throne. But in January 1886, Queen Victoria's declared the new sovereign of Burma, and Burma is annexed. Annexation, pure and simple, is the solution. But from that time right up into the 1890s, Burmese groups were resisting this. And Myingun from Benares, and then after his escape from British Benares into the French territory, a small enclave of Chandernagore, and then from his escape from French Chandernagore to French Pondicherry, and this was happening in 1882, 1883, 1884, all of this time he's actively scheming and dreaming of a return to Burma and moving from British territory to French territory. He's playing off the British and the French. And we look back and we think, oh, there are these 3 Anglo-Burmese wars and they decided the fate of Burma. But even after the annexation of Upper Burma by the British in 1886, the French were also still vying for control in Burma, especially of the Shan states. And the future of Laos was not settled until 1893. At the same time, you have civil war in Cambodia. All of these things are happening in the region. And Myingun is playing not only the French and the British off against each other, but he's also courting and being courted by Shan Sao Pa, Karen leaders, and others. And so the book that I've been working on is not just about Myingun. It's not a biography. It's bringing to life the history of this region at this time by looking at the aspirations and imaginations of the different possibilities in Burma at this time.
Right. And Prince Myingun actually never succeeded in any of his ambitions, and he died in Saigon. You've mentioned he was there in, I think it was 1921. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. He died in Saigon in 1921, and he never succeeded in returning to Burma, much less in regaining the throne. But he did succeed in buoying up and offering participation in a movement to many Burmese and Shan and Karen, and not only in Burma, but also in Chiang Mai, for example, where there are still Burmese temples, which through oral histories are in some ways connected with Myingun. He was offering these people a vision and a hope of participation in a future that wasn't British colonial. And so, yes, we can say that he failed. He never reclaimed the throne, but he succeeded for a long time in mobilizing supporters. And he offered them promises he couldn't deliver on in many cases. He offered them titles. He gave people titles like his prime minister, his adjutor. He offered them future holdings of land and he offered them status, but he also had something else to offer them, and that was hope. It was his persistent belief in his ability that he could succeed next time and he could rise up from failure. And I think it was this quality that must have been very attractive to those who were dispossessed, who did oppose British rule. And again, when we look back at this period, and it's easy to think in terms of the maps and the boundaries that were later drawn by the British, by the French, and in negotiation with Siam, it's easy to forget that there were many different movements at the time, including alliances between Irish nationalists and Sikh nationalists who were really hoping to overturn and topple British rule in India. And one of the really interesting things to me, and one of the most fascinating episodes during Myingun's years of exile, was his time in Pondicherry, where he entered a loose alliance with Sikhs, especially with Sardar Thakur Sandanwalia Singh, who was the nephew of Maharaja Dulip Singh. And Myingun became quite close to these Sikhs. He shared a house with them at one point. Thakur Singh died in 1887. He remained in fairly close contact with Thakur Singh's son, Gorbachand, and loosely with the Maharaja Dulip Singh. And so Myingun saw himself as part of a bigger movement. It wasn't just about what had happened in 1866, and he's often viewed through that frame. It was about how he could use his status as a princely exile to work with others to remake the map of Burma and India. And it was ambitious. Many who met him, including, for example, Dorsen Go, the Burmese civil servant, archaeologist, and actually secret agent who did a couple of missions to try and talk Myingun over back to the British camp when Myingun was in Saigon with the French. He and others, and Burmese historians too, have described Myingun as being really out of touch with reality and have not having a clear sense of geography. And I think differently because Myingun was one of the few royals, by which I mean the few princely contenders and exiles, so the Naungyan, the Naungyo princes, who ended up in British India, Tibor, King Tibor. Unlike them, Prince Myingun actually really did travel. I mean, he traveled by steamboat, he traveled by pony, he traveled in numerous disguises around and across these different parts of empire, from the penal colony of the Andamans to Fort Chunar, to being under house arrest in Benares, to moving across and through to Chandernagore and eluding British detectives on his trail, to then moving across to Pondicherry, and always with an ever-widening network of people who were not only supporters, but who saw a common or a shared interest in Myingun's schemes and dreams, who saw in him sort of political capital, if you were. And these included Armenians, they included Farsi gem merchants, Bengali political agents that Myingun appointed in Calcutta. They included Scottish bankers. They included the King of Cambodia, King Norodom, who he never met, but he traded letters with him through his messengers. So there's really a much wider network going on here. And there's a very open-ended way that he's thinking. And of course, another way of looking at all this is just, well, he was wanting to accrue political capital for himself, which would translate into actual assets. The treaties and agreements that he sort of offered the British and the French often revolved around control of assets and what he would do with monopolies. And something that I'm looking at in my book is what I call adventure capital. That is both the capital, the finances and supplies that people put up for Myingun in his movement, and also the capital gains that he himself sought to accrue. And more broadly speaking, the role of gem mines and timber and natural resources, not only in British calculations, but in calculations of royal power in Burma. One thing I'm trying to do with the book is to question some of these very abstract and ethereal and frankly grandiose notions of royalty that have sort of become fossilized in Southeast Asian studies, such as the primacy of the Mount Meru model or various other paradigms of kingship, and to actually look at how power was really playing out on the ground, both in Burma in the Gonbaung dynasty and through movements such as that led by Myingun.
So this is all really fascinating, thinking about this kind of regional context. And when we think of like resistance to colonial rule at this time, it's usually cast as, nationalist kind of en masse by people sharing their common ancestral languages and histories. But this Myingun and Thakur Sandanwalia Singh and others you've mentioned show us a really different kind of resistance and collaboration that seems to be sort of forged by shared cosmopolitan experiences. But what about this sort of social world that they inhabited and the language side of it? So was Prince Myingun travelling around speaking English fluently, speaking French fluently? How did he communicate with King Norodom? And did he ever reach a point where this status, this adventure capital, all of this maintenance of his kind of prestige, do you think was more kind of cynical? Did he reach an older age where he thought he was never going to go back to what was, independent Myanmar, but he was going to continue on his path dependency, if you will? Just some ideas you've made me think of.
Oh, yeah, that's a wonderful question about language, Luke, and I'm so glad you asked that. Throughout his time in Benares and in his dealings with Armenians, with Bengalis, with Farsis, Myingun was mostly conversing in Urdu. And Urdu was the lingua franca of much of empire at that time among the colonized in South and Southeast Asia. So similarly with Thakur Singh, within the household, they were also conversing in Urdu. Some of the most fascinating characters and intriguing are interpreters, and I'm just generally interested in the role of translators and interpreters. So he had figures in his court who would interpret and translate into English or into French. Now, what happened after Myingun moved to Benares, he was so disgusted and fed up with his treatment by the British that he apparently refused to read any more English newspapers. But he would have the news brought to him. And when he moved to French territory, I'm not sure the extent to which he spoke French. He probably learned some French. He did at a point have French newspapers delivered to him. Within his household, the language that he spoke with his children, with his family members, and that would include his nephews and his niece, who he adopted. Very tragically, his younger brother Myingun died in Benares in 1884, in October 1884. And at that time, Myingun was in Pondicherry. He'd already moved there. Myingun ended up adopting his nephews and his niece and raised them as his own sons. It's a very famous photo of Myingun and his sons, and the sons in that photo are his nephews. But tragically, all of his sons, including his nephews, died before he did, of different causes. One tragically of suicide in Saigon. So I've gone a long way from your question about language. Myingun himself continued to speak and keep up in Burmese. He read devotional texts in Burmese in his later years. You asked about how Myingun's ambitions changed. And one thing that is very clear is the way that Myingun himself changed as he aged. He became more settled in himself. I think he'd been a very restless figure, not only politically, but in terms of his own family life, if you will. And he seemed to become more settled after he'd adopted the nephews and then moved to Saigon. His secretary, who ended up writing and publishing a memoir, which he claimed that Myingun had dictated to him in sort of his twilight years, that was all in Burmese. So in terms of the letters that were written to King Norodom, those have been preserved in the archives, and much of these letters have come to me through research in British archives in New Delhi, in London principally, and French archives in Aix-en-Provence, the Archives d'Outre-mer, and as well as archives, of course, in Yangon, and French archives in Cambodia, which is where I first came across Myingun. I came across Myingun's story through a letter that I read by chance in the archives in Phnom Penh. So Myingun's letters were in French, but they were written by a secretary. And there's one or two letters and statements that he's signed, Myingun, in cursive Roman script, and the letterhead is in Burmese.
Now we've touched a little bit on Myingun's character as he aged, and we know from our conversation that he seemed ambitious and stubborn. You've talked a little bit about the different sources and the different points of view that you've used to put together this book. One of his British hosts called him thoroughly unscrupulous. I wonder about any observations you can make as an historian about his character. Anything more? I mean, this coup that he was involved in was hideously violent and involved mass murder In fact, his uncle's head was decapitated and paraded around the palace. This was how Myingun Mintha started his journey as an exile. So, was he a violent man, or was he always detached? Is he always seen through a depersonalized, textual kind of lens?
Again, it's a very helpful question, Lou, and I say helpful because I'm doing the final touches on my book and thinking about the continuity and organization of some strands in the book, and the question of who was Myingun, what kind of a person was he? It depends on who you're talking to and whose account you're reading. And of course, you could relate to this on the questions that you're asking. And there are multiple Myinguns. There's the murderer, the assassin, the bad boy prince. There's the Burmese rebel who was standing up and with the people against the British. There's the stooge of the British. Some people think the British put him up to it. There's the, treacherous nephew, and then there's the chivalrous rogue. There's a bullying uncle. His niece in Benares, when his brother died, she actually ran away and didn't want to be in Myingun's household, which indicates he could be a bit of a bully. I don't know what else is behind that. He's a shrewd operator, but he's also seen as a passive pawn. He's an elephant whisperer. He's credited with subduing an elephant that was running amok in a zoo in Saigon. And the King Chulalongkorn of Siam called him a bandit and a wicked man who'd wrought evil on his father. Others visiting him found him really polite, courteous, devout. But what he did play into and certainly exceeded in the coup was this idea of a bad boy prince. Earlier on, his father, King Mindon, had actually two terms of endearment for Myingun, which show a different side to his character potentially. And one was apparently Maung Ba Ji, or Mr. Bao Ji, which Mindon coined for him when he was quite young, perhaps in reference to Mindon's father, Bajidor, who died 2 years after Myingun was born. Mindon's other nickname for Myingun was my son Silavaka, which is derived from a Sanskrit term, Sila, which is all about observing the moral precepts, so calling him a virtuous boy. And Myingun's grandson, who very generously shared his time with me to talk about his grandfather Myingun, interpreted this as a reflection of Myingun's seriousness, that he rarely smiled apparently and was seen as a very serious figure in some ways, but it could also reflect Mindon's sense of humor. I think we tend to forget that when we're using words in Pali and Sanskrit and other words, they're not always serious. So by which I mean that he could have been, that is King Mindon, well, oh yeah, my virtuous son, because he did gain a reputation, and his brother, a bit of a reputation for being, impolite, strong-headed, and there are various tales about that in their sort of late teenage years. One of the chapters in my book is looking at letters, and a lot of the book looks at different forms of narratives about Myingun to try and get a sense of how people related to Myingun through what kind of stories. So the exiled prince, the figure of the exiled prince is a very common figure in Buddhist narratives, in the Jataka, as well as in the Tirirama or the Burmese Ramayana, with the figure of the exile. In these narratives, there are tales of redemption and return and regaining the kingdom. But of course, in the Jataka stories and Prince Rama in the Ramayana and its Burmese variations are essentially good figures who are modeled on or are presaging the Buddha. The narratives into which Myingun was playing, and one of the narratives which is believed to have really set him off on this course, were narratives of a sort of playboy, bad boy prince who was exiled to the island of Lanka and who then eventually reclaimed the kingdom. And one of the chapters in my book is looking at performance, is looking at plays, is looking at the power of theatre, and it's looking at an actual performance of a play that was scripted by Uponya and performed at the palace, which was one such tale. So, yes, he had committed a heinous crime. He had not necessarily himself decapitated his uncle. There were other henchmen and sword wielders or da wielders on scene, but he had orchestrated it. But in these narratives, there is scope for redemption and return. And the defense that Myingun and his brother put up after the fact for their act was that first they had been tipped off that the Crown Prince was going to murder both of them. And one of the stories goes that the person who had tipped them off was Myingun's wife, who was the daughter of the Crown Prince. And that was the Daimyo Mintami, the princess of Daimyo, who he'd married at the age of 22. And another strand of that is that his uncle had been mistreating him and the Myingun Dain. So whether or not it was a preemptive strike, it was a crime. His father did banish him from the kingdom. There's also some speculation that King Mindon might have to some extent been in on this, if not behind it, but aware of it. And that the assassination of the Crown Prince actually fulfilled a rumor that the king was going to die. And by having the future king die, this meant that King Mindon could no longer be the one who would realize this prophecy, not rumor. And this is something that Aurore Condier has done really wonderful work on. So in terms of his character, he himself in his later years and in 1890s in Saigon, in conversation with Burmese assistant commissioner who traveled to Saigon posing as someone who had no official position but was a timber and rice merchant, to try and get Myingun to think about coming back over and into British Burma and into the British fold and renouncing his claims on the throne. And in that interview, this Burmese assistant commissioner, Sorlapu, I think his name was, he was impressed by Myingun as being incredibly courteous, incredibly polite, very dapper. And Myingun had offered him a drink and then gone on to tell him that, well, I don't really drink anymore. But once upon a time, I used to really indulge. And I used to be, as he put it, a real scamp. But, I've reformed my ways. But he, right up through till the 1910s, Myingun was still scheming. And one of the most interesting schemes to me is the one which brought Myingun to my attention when I was in Cambodia and in the archives in Phnom Penh and doing some research on Pailin and the gem mines in Pailin, which is a border area, Thai-Cambodia border. There was this letter from Prince Myingun requesting passage for a monk, a Burmese monk, U Vilasa, who was off to Pailin to establish a Burmese monastery. And this was going on in the 1910s. One of Myingun's sons was set up in Phnom Penh. And in Pailin, there was a Burmese community. But more interestingly, in Pailin, there are gem mines. There are still gem mines. And so Myingun's aspirations were not always very far from the money or the lucre, if you like, that could also be gained from claiming followers.
All right, that's excellent. We've got a little bit more of a handle there about his quote-unquote sort of character or what we can know about it. But you also talk about Myingun Mintha sort of as a trickster figure. So what do you mean by trickster? Are you talking sort of conceptually or in the archive? Or do you mean that he literally was a trickster?
Okay, so I did talk about Myingun as a trickster in the chapter I wrote for Ronit Rich's book, Exile in Colonial Asia. And the idea to cast Myingun as a trickster figure came to me through Lewis Hyde's wonderful book called Trickster Makes This World. And I was reading it in around 2012, I think it was, for a freshman seminar I developed at Berkeley on South and Southeast Asian folklore. It was called elephant, monkey, rabbit. And the rabbit is a really key trickster figure, and not only Brer Rabbit, but the rabbit or judge rabbit, Sapirtun say, in Cambodia is very erudite, very smart, very savvy, and mostly very fair judge figure. But he's also a bit of a trickster. And Judge Rabbit has a twin of sorts in Burmese folklore, and who similarly displays wisdom and insight and a nose for justice. And he's a dignified figure, but this Judge Rabbit, the rabbit in the folklore, he can also be a bit of a con artist and a master of deception. And sometimes his capers put him on the wrong side of justice. And then he gets his comeuppance. But it's these stories that make him a more compelling and ultimately, although he's, of course, anthropomorphized, a more human or relatable figure. So I've always thought tricksters are quite fascinating because they're subversive and they're always on the move and they're always outsmarting and outguessing others. And they're masters of reinvention and disguise. And also the trickster figure is universal, and you'll find a trickster in pretty much every culture's folklore. And of course, Buddhist lore and the way that it's been related and interpreted in visual culture and narratives and performance in Burma and in Cambodia also does have these negative trickster figures like the Brahmin Jujuk or Suzuka from the Vasantara Jataka, who tricks the Prince Vasantara out of his children. But that's one example. And there are demons who are masters of disguise in these narratives, who would have peopled the worldview of Myingun and his supporters. But there are also deities and celestial figures and positive forces in these tales who are masters of disguise. And why I keep talking about disguise is that Myingun was a master of disguise. He effected so many escapes from one territory to another in disguise. And there were many disguises. He disguised himself as a sailor, not just as a sailor, one account ran, but as a European sailor, no less. Or he disguised himself as a beggar man. So he was able to physically transform himself, not only by putting on different clothing, but by adapting different mannerisms and ways of being in different situations. And what I really love about this is that it is so subversive of the expectations that the British and the French had about how a prince should look. And, many people have asked me, well, Prince Myingun, he was a prince. How could he have, gone through all these different disguises? Wasn't that very demeaning? But Burmese have never asked me that question. And I think there's an awareness that whatever disguise you put on, what you retain, what's intact is dignity. And in the Burmese case, also phone, this sense of sort of an innate glory or strength of character or charisma. And that these external trappings, to an extent, although again, there's sort of reams written about how important they are in kingship in Southeast Asia, but that's actually only part of the story. And Myingun was really proud of these adventures, and he talks about them in his stories. He passed on these stories passed on down through to his grandchildren. They weren't something he was ashamed of. And there are other stories of figures also in the Sikh community who I talk about in my book. There's a wonderful example of someone who escaped from Fortuna, disguised well beneath their status. So I think it's the subversiveness of this reverse role play that I still find very intriguing, but I don't use this term, the trickster, so much actually in my book. It was helpful to me at the time when I was writing the chapter for Ronit Rich's volume.
Thanks. That's a good explanation about where this trickster idea came from. And I should have mentioned that I did pick it up from an earlier publication of yours. And you've mentioned now again this fantastic sounding book. So can I ask, what would be the key takeaway from your upcoming book? What can we learn about Burmese history, the history of Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian studies in general, from this book? And when can we hope to read it?
This book that I am bringing to a close, I would love for it to be in press by September the 20th of this year, 2021, which marks 100 years since the Myingun Prince passed in Saigon. By this September might be a bit ambitious. So I'm hoping that it will be in press by next year. One of the things this book is doing is writing against the grain of what Michael Charney has called events-based history. And that is a history which reduces British Burma and colonial rule to these three pivotal events: the First Anglo-Burmese War, the Second Anglo-Burmese War, and the Third Anglo-Burmese War, and rather to show that this, especially the late 19th centuries from the 1860s, but especially from the 1880s to the late 1890s, was a period of intense turmoil. And these events were not discrete events. History is a messy and unfinished business. Another thing that I'm doing with this book is drawing on multiple different narrative genres alongside archival records. And those records in the archives include cameos and sketches of, for example, Myingun's followers. They include fragments of letters that were snatched from his followers. I'm looking alongside those official records at other forms of history and storytelling and transmission, which include songs, Burmese songs of exile. They include poetry. So many of Myingun's supporters sent him poems, and his story passed around orally. His followers, some of them, as a mark of joining his movement, would make an oath. I'm looking at prophecies and how these circulated, and rumors, and the power of rumor, and the power of what was not an official historical fact to both make and influence the course of history. An example of this is that rumors about Myingun's return led to a fall in the price of rice, for example. And the British were always terribly anxious to record and find out and write down these rumors. So I'm also reading the archive as a mirror of some of these vernacular texts, if you will, but also free them of the anxieties of the British. What the book is doing by tracing the history and the story and the journey of Myingun is showing just how connected different histories were in the region, that we cannot insulate British Burma and French Indochina and the Sikh movement, that these were all on some levels connected. And ironically, what colonialism has done is that even with subaltern studies, even within schools of scholarship that have risen up and developed against the grain of British colonial rule or French colonial rule, those schools are often still working within these boundaries, within the boundaries of British India, from which, you know, Burma is sort of really not included or seen as an outlier. And Myingun's story really shows how these borders were fictions. And it also shows, and here finally I'm getting to the key takeaway from this book, and something that these stories and these journeys have shown to me is that for so many people in Southeast Asia at the time, the idea of the nation as, you know, the sacrosanct unit of identity around which people would mobilize against colonialism, that idea, it really wasn't so relevant to so many people so much of the time, or at least all of the time, and certainly not in the 1880s to 1890s, which is when the crux of this later movement unfolds. And also that print capitalism and newspapers are really just part of a much broader repertoire of narrative and literature and visual and other media, which both transmitted and shaped people's impressions. And finally, that alongside these wonderful palm manuscripts and canonical texts and religious treatises, there were all sorts of other transitional literatures floating around. They included plays. So amazing dramatic scripts were being produced in the 1870s, which imagined alternative futures. Some palm leaf manuscripts were actually, rifle licenses or gun licenses or commercial treaties. And I think there's been this sort of segregation of different forms of text in Southeast Asian studies, that if something's a palm manuscript, it's got to be some ancient religious treatise. If something's a newspaper, it's got to be really full of national imaginings, which of course is what I wrote about so much in my book Cambodge. But actually, if you look at a newspaper, I mean, it's full of all sorts of things. It's full of, the elephant merchant trying to sell off an elephant, and the cigar seller, and then there's the advert, and then there's scurrilous rumors and people being run out of town, and there's letters to the editor. And actually a lot of what newspapers are doing and the vernacular press is not really actually necessarily about imagining a nation. So yeah, that's maybe one of the key, or two or three or more key takeaways.
Well, that's awesome, and I really hope that we can read it in the year marking 100 years since the death of Prince Myingun. That would be sensational. Now, we always like to ask our guests to finish the episode by offering a recommendation to our listeners. Now, these recommendations can be for anything to do with Myanmar, that is. So, Penny, did you bring a recommendation along?
Well, I brought a few, but I'm going to give the full reference for the new book by Aurore Condier. I've mentioned her work a couple of times in the podcast, and she's done just beautiful work on cultural history and different ways of imagining in Burma. And it's in French, so forgive my French accent, La réforme politique en Birmanie pendant le premier moment colonial. And it's produced by École Française d'Extrême-Orient. And it just came out earlier this year. And I also wanted to put in a plug for François Tinturier's wonderful book that's forthcoming with the National University of Singapore Press. And these two scholars, Aurore Condier and François Tinturier, who have spent so much time on the ground in Burma and variously trained in London, where François did his PhD at SOAS, in Paris, where Aurore Condier did her PhD. They are looking through all sorts of very rich sources at what was going on in the Kombang dynasty. So I would recommend both of those books, but I will put in another plug. Another thing I talk about a bit in the book is gnats and gnat spirits. And I have mentioned poetry, but there's a wonderful new book of poems out by the Burmese American poet Mo Hsien Win, which has just been longlisted actually for the PEN Literary Prize in the US. And it is called A Storage Unit for the Spirit House.
Those are three sensational recommendations, and I can't wait for the English translation of Aurora's book. Thank you so much, Penny, for coming onto Myanmar Musings and introducing and talking about Myingun Mintha with us here. It's been really great.
Well, thank you, Luke. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's perfectly timed. Thank you for having me.